Rain hammered the concrete. A man was dying outside the ER, no name, no ID, no one coming for him. Everyone saw him, the nurses, the guards, the cameras, and everyone looked away, except one. Jihin Williams stepped into the storm and carried him inside. They fired him for it the next morning, in front of everyone. You should have known your place. That's what they told him. But here's the thing about moments like that. Someone is always watching. And what they didn't know was who that old man really was. The rain started just after 11. It came down hard and sudden, the kind of downpour that turned the streets into shallow rivers within minutes. St. Albans Memorial Hospital sat on the corner of 9th and Drayton, a towering glass and concrete building that glowed pale blue against the dark sky. It was one of the most expensive private hospitals in the city, the kind of place where senators got their knee replacements and tech executives checked in for exhaustion. The emergency entrance faced the east side, shielded by a narrow concrete awning that did almost nothing against wind-driven rain. Jihin Williams stood inside the security booth watching the storm through a wall of monitors. He was 33 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, in a way that made people forget he was in the room. He had been working the night shift at St. Albans for almost 2 years, now 5 nights a week, 8 hours a night. He knew every hallway, every stairwell, every camera angle. He knew which doctors left early and which nurses took smoke breaks by the loading dock. He knew all of it, and none of them knew him. That was fine. Jihin didn't need to be known. He needed to be employed. On the desk beside his monitors sat a small notebook, edges worn soft from handling. He carried it everywhere, had for years. Inside were notes he wrote to himself, things he'd read, things he wanted to learn, systems he wanted to understand. Hospital logistics, emergency protocols, management theory. Nobody had ever asked him about the notebook. Nobody had ever asked him about anything. He had a routine for every shift. Check the perimeter cameras at the top of each hour. Walk the east wing at midnight, the west wing at 2. Log every entry and exit in the system. The routine was small and invisible like Jihin himself, but it kept things running. It kept the building safe. And not once in 2 years had anyone thanked him for it, not the doctors who walked past his booth without a glance, not the administrators who forgot his name on the schedule, not Richard Hale, the director of operations, who had once referred to security staff in a board meeting as replaceable overhead. Jihin had heard about that. He never mentioned it. His radio crackled. A voice from the front desk, Brenda Cole, the receptionist on duty, came through flat and bored. Jihin, we've got a guy outside the east entrance again, looks homeless, probably drunk. You want to deal with it? Jihin leaned toward the monitor showing the east side camera. Through the rain and the low-resolution feed, he could see a figure lying on the ground near the emergency doors. Not sitting, not leaning. Lying flat face partially turned into the wet concrete. He's down, Jihin said into the radio. Not moving. So, call the cops, Brenda replied. Or just leave him. He'll get up when he gets cold enough. Jihin didn't answer. He grabbed his flashlight and jacket and stepped out of the booth. The hallway leading to the east entrance was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow tone that hospitals seemed to prefer at night. Jihin pushed through the double doors and stepped into the rain. The old man was lying on his side, arms pulled tight against his chest. His clothes were soaked through a thin jacket that might have once been brown pants torn at one-knee shoes that had lost their laces long ago. His white hair was matted flat against his skull, and his skin had a grayish tint that Jihin recognized immediately. That wasn't the color of someone sleeping it off. That was the color of someone whose body was shutting down. Jihin crouched beside him and put 2 fingers against the man's neck. The pulse was there, but faint and irregular. The old man's lips were cracked, slightly blue. His breathing came in shallow, stuttering waves. "Sir, can you hear me?" Jihin said, shielding the man's face from the rain with his own body. "Sir, I need you to open your eyes." The old man's eyelids fluttered. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Jihin looked back toward the emergency entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see the intake desk, the bright lights of the waiting area, the empty chairs. He could see Nurse Diane Prescott sitting behind the triage counter scrolling through her phone. He keyed his radio. "I need medical out here, east entrance. Elderly male unresponsive, possible hypothermia." The radio was quiet for a few seconds. Then Diane's voice came through clipped and professional in the way that meant she had already decided the answer was no. "Is he a patient?" "He's a person lying on the ground." "Does he have ID, insurance card, anything?" Jihin looked at the old man. No wallet, no bag, no identification of any kind. Just a human being dissolving in the rain. "No." "Then call 911, Diane said. "We're not equipped to take in unregistered individuals. You know the protocol, Jihin." Jihin did know the protocol. He had read it 3 times. It was in his notebook, page 47, highlighted in blue. Unregistered individuals presenting at the emergency entrance without verified insurance or identification are to be directed to public emergency services. Under no circumstances should hospital resources be allocated without prior authorization from the attending physician or operations manager on duty. He knew the protocol. He also knew what hypothermia did to a 60-something-year-old man with no shelter and no one coming for him. He knew that an ambulance would take 20 to 30 minutes in this weather. He knew that 20 to 30 minutes might be 15 minutes too many. Jihin looked at the old man again. Looked at his hands, and something about them registered strangely. The fingers were thin, long, no calluses, no scars from manual labor. The nails were dirty, caked with grime, but underneath the dirt, they were trimmed, neatly, deliberately. It was a small thing, barely worth noticing. Jihin noticed it anyway and then let it go. It didn't matter whose hands they were. What mattered was that they were turning blue. He made his decision the way he always made decisions, without announcement, without drama. But this time, something heavier sat behind it. He thought about the protocol in his notebook. He thought about what Diane had said, what Brenda had said, what every sensible person in that building would say. He thought about the fact that in 2 years he had never once broken a rule. Not once. And he thought about what it meant that following every rule perfectly had never once earned him anything more than being invisible. Then he stopped thinking. He simply stood up, bent down, hooked his arms under the old man's body, and lifted. The man weighed almost nothing. Jihin carried him through the emergency doors, past the intake desk, past Diane Prescott, who looked up from her phone with wide eyes, and into the nearest open bay. He set the old man down on a gurney, pulled the curtain shut, and went straight to the supply closet. He came back with 2 thermal blankets, a bottle of saline solution, and a blood pressure cuff. "Jihin!" Diane was standing outside the curtain, arms crossed. "You can't do this." "He's dying," Jihin said, without looking at her. He wrapped the first blanket around the old man's torso and tucked the second one around his legs. The man's body was trembling violently now, which was actually a good sign. Shivering meant his body was still fighting. "That's not our problem," Diane said. "He's not in the system. There's no file, no chart, no authorization. If something goes wrong, this falls on the hospital, on us. Then put him in the system." "I can't just, Jihin, you know, I can't just make up a file." "Then I'll call Dr. Rivera." Diane's expression shifted. Dr. James Rivera was the attending physician on night duty, and waking him for an unregistered homeless man was the kind of move that got people remembered, and not in a good way. "Don't," Diane said. "Seriously, don't drag him into this." But Jihin was already dialing. Dr. Rivera arrived 12 minutes later wearing scrubs and an expression that made it clear he had been pulled from the on-call room mid-sleep. He scanned the bay, the old man on the gurney, Jihin standing beside him, Diane in the corner, shaking her head slowly. "Who authorized this intake?" Dr. Rivera asked. "I brought him in," Jihin said. "He was outside the east entrance. Hypothermia. Pulse was weak and irregular when I found him." "Your security," Dr. Rivera said. The way he said it made the word sound like a box, something Jihin was supposed to stay inside of. "Yes, sir." And you carried a man with no ID, no insurance, no medical history into my emergency bay and used hospital supplies to treat him. I used 2 blankets and a saline kit. Dr. Rivera held Jihin's gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to the old man on the gurney. The doctor's training took over whether he wanted it to or not. He checked the vitals, listened to the breathing, examined the extremities. After a minute, he straightened up. He's hypothermic, mildly dehydrated. Pulse is stabilizing, but I want an IV and continuous monitoring for the next few hours. He turned to Diane. Open a John Doe file, temporary. I'll sign off on it. Diane opened her mouth to protest, but Dr. Rivera was already walking away. He stopped at the curtain and looked back at Jihin. Next time call 911, he said. That's what they're for. Then he was gone. Diane glared at Jihin as she sat down at the nearest terminal and began entering the temporary file. Her fingers hit the keys harder than necessary. "You're going to regret this," she muttered. "When Hale finds out, and he will find out you're done." Jihin said nothing. He pulled a chair next to the old man's gurney and sat down. The monitors beeped in slow, steady rhythm. The rain hammered against the windows. The old man's breathing was evening out his color, slowly returning from gray to something closer to human. In the security booth, the camera feeds continued to record. Every frame, every angle, every decision Jihin had made in the last 40 minutes was now stored on the hospital's server, time-stamped and waiting. Across the hall, Brenda Cole at the front desk leaned over to a passing orderly named Derek Shaw, a young guy who worked the night shift mostly to avoid his landlord. "Did you see that?" Brenda said, nodding toward the emergency bay. "Williams just carried a bum in off the street. Full hero mode." Derek glanced toward the curtain, then back at Brenda. He shrugged. "Not my business, and it shouldn't be his either." "Exactly," Brenda said. She lowered her voice, though no one else was around to hear. "You watch. Hale's gonna pull the footage first thing in the morning, and when he does, Williams is cooked." She tapped her fingernail on the desk twice, a small, satisfied rhythm. "Some people just don't know how to stay in their lane." She picked up her magazine and flipped to where she'd left off. By 1:30 in the morning, the old man's vitals had stabilized. His body temperature was rising. The IV drip was doing its work. Jihin sat beside the gurney, his notebook open on his knee, but he wasn't writing anything. He was watching the old man's face. There was something about it. Not the dirt, not the sunburn, not the deep lines carved by weather and time. Something underneath all that. The bone structure was sharp, angular. Even in sleep, the man's expression carried a kind of weight, not the slack emptiness of unconsciousness, but something that looked more like a man who had chosen to close his eyes. Like he was resting, not collapsing. Jihin closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. It didn't matter, the man was alive, that was enough. What Jihin didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in 6 hours, Richard Hale would arrive at the hospital, sit down at his desk, and pull up the security footage from the east entrance. He would watch every second of it. He would watch Jihin carry a homeless man through doors that were meant for paying patients. He would watch Jihin use hospital property without authorization. He would watch Jihin call the on-duty physician for a man who existed nowhere in any system. And Richard Hale would see exactly what he always saw when someone broke the rules, not a person being saved, but a liability being created. The storm outside was fading. The old man slept. And Jihin Williams sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, not knowing that the thing he had just done, the simplest, most human thing, was about to cost him everything he had. Richard Hale arrived at St. Albans Memorial at 7:15 every morning. He parked in the same reserved spot near the west entrance, carried the same leather briefcase, wore the same type of charcoal suit with the same type of silver tie clip. He was a man of systems, and he believed, truly believed, that systems were the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. He was at his desk by 7:30, coffee black, no sugar, emails first, then the overnight reports. Then, as he did every morning, he pulled up the security camera logs from the previous night. He found it within 4 minutes. The footage was clear despite the rain. Camera East 7 showed Jihin Williams leaving the security booth at 11:22. Camera East 3 showed him outside crouching over a figure on the ground. Camera East 1 showed him carrying that figure, an elderly man in torn clothing, clearly not a patient, through the emergency doors and into a treatment bay. Camera Interior 12 showed him taking supplies from the closet. 2 thermal blankets, saline, a blood pressure cuff. Richard Hale watched the footage twice. Then he picked up his phone. Jihin was still on the hospital grounds when the call came. His shift had ended at 7, but he had stayed to check on the old man one more time before leaving. The man was asleep, breathing, steady, color improved. The John Doe file that Diane Prescott had reluctantly created sat in the system like a small act of defiance. The message was short. Report to the Director of Operations office. Immediately. Richard Hale's office was on the 3rd floor east wing. It had a glass wall that overlooked the main atrium, a design choice that let him watch the hospital floor below like a man watching a machine he owned. When Jihin walked in, Hale was standing behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, the security footage frozen on his computer screen. He didn't offer Jihin a seat. "Last night," Hale began, his voice, measured and flat, "you left your assigned post at 11:22. You used hospital supplies, blankets, saline medical equipment without authorization. You physically carried an unregistered individual into the emergency bay. And you contacted the on-duty physician under what I can only describe as misleading circumstances." He turned the monitor slightly so Jihin could see the frozen frame himself carrying the old man through the doors. "Did I miss anything?" Jihin stood with his hands at his sides. "He was dying, sir. People die every day, Mr. Williams. Outside this hospital. Outside every hospital. If every security guard in the country decided to drag strangers off the sidewalk and into a treatment bay, the entire healthcare system would collapse within a week." Hale sat down, opened a drawer, and pulled out a printed form. "This is a formal written warning. First offense. It goes in your permanent file. One more incident of this nature, and your employment here will be terminated. Are we clear?" "He would have died," Jihin said again. Not louder, not softer, just the same words because they were the only ones that mattered. Hale studied him with the expression of a man looking at a piece of furniture placed in the wrong room. "This is a hospital, Mr. Williams, not a shelter. We operate on systems insurance protocols. The moment we start making exceptions based on feelings, we stop being a hospital and start being a liability. Sign the form." Jihin signed it. He walked out of the office and took the elevator down to the 1st floor. On his way through the lobby, he passed Brenda Cole at the front desk. She didn't look up from her computer, but she spoke anyway. "Heard you got called upstairs," she said, her voice carrying that same flat tone from the night before. "Told you, some people just don't learn." Jihin kept walking. Derek Shaw was mopping the hallway near the supply corridor. He saw Jihin coming and stepped aside without a word. But as Jihin passed, Derek muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Should have left him out there, man. Wasn't worth it." Jihin didn't respond. He walked out the west entrance into the morning light and drove home. But he came back that evening. Not for his shift. His next rotation wasn't until the following night. He came back for the old man. He brought a sandwich from the deli on 14th Street. Turkey and Swiss, nothing fancy. He bought it with his own money, $7.50, that he probably should have saved. He walked into the hospital through the main entrance past Brenda's empty desk. The day receptionist didn't know him well enough to question why he was there, and found his way to the bay where the old man was still lying. The curtain was half open. The old man was awake. He was sitting up slightly against the raised back of the gurney, his eyes open and clear. The grayish pallor from the night before was gone, replaced by something warmer, though his face was still deeply lined and weathered. He turned his head when Jihin appeared, and his eyes, sharp-focused, tracked Jihin with a precision that didn't belong to a man recovering from hypothermia. Not the dull, grateful look of someone rescued. Something far more deliberate. "You're the one who brought me in," the old man said. His voice was quiet, slightly hoarse, but the words came out precise. No slurring, no rambling. Each syllable placed exactly where it belonged. Jihin set the sandwich on the bedside tray. "How are you feeling?" "Like a man who almost froze to death." The old man looked at the sandwich, then back at Jihin. "You bought this? It's nothing." "It's not nothing." The old man unwrapped the sandwich slowly, his fingers moving with a kind of care that didn't match his appearance. Long fingers, no tremor. "What's your name?" "Jihin. Jihin Williams." The old man took a bite, chewed slowly, and nodded. "I'm Harold." He didn't offer a last name. Jihin pulled up the same plastic chair from the night before and sat down. He didn't know why he was here exactly. The man was alive. The doctors would discharge him once he was stable enough. There was no reason for Jihin to be sitting in this bay on his night off spending money he didn't have on a sandwich for a man he didn't know. But something kept him there. Something about the way Harold looked at the room around him, not like a patient taking in his surroundings, but like a man conducting an inspection. His eyes moved across the monitors, the curtain rail, the supply card in the corner, the way the nurses walked past without checking on him. He watched everything the way someone watches when they're keeping score. "This hospital," Harold said, still chewing. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 2 years." "And they treat everyone like this." Harold's eyes flicked toward the hallway where a nurse had just walked past the bay without so much as a glance. "Or just the ones who don't have the right paperwork?" Jihin didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Harold finished the sandwich and reached for the cup of water on the tray. He picked it up with his right hand, 3 fingers curled around the cup, pinky extended slightly, not in a performative way, but in the automatic, ingrained way of someone who had spent a lifetime drinking from glasses that weren't made of plastic. Jihin noticed it. It was the same instinct that had made him notice the nails, the fingers, the bone structure. Small things. Things that didn't add up to a man who slept on sidewalks. "You'll get in trouble for this," Harold said, setting the cup down. "Coming back here, bringing food. They don't want people like me in places like this." "I already got in trouble," Jihin said. "Written warning this morning?" Harold studied him. "And you came back anyway. You need to eat." Something shifted in the old man's expression. A flicker behind the eyes, not gratitude, not surprise. Something older and heavier than either of those. He looked down at his hands folded on the blanket and spoke quietly. "I've eaten at the most expensive tables in the world, son. Private rooms, waiters who knew my name. Wine that cost more than most people's rent." He met Jihin's eyes. None of those meals were as warm as this one. Jihin assumed the old man was speaking in metaphor, the kind of poetic exaggeration that people used when they wanted to say thank you without actually saying it. He nodded and let the words go. He shouldn't have. Over the next 2 days, Jihin came back each evening. He brought food, a container of soup one night, a wrapped burrito the next. He brought a clean undershirt from his own closet because the hospital hadn't provided Harold with a change of clothes. He sat with the old man for an hour each time, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in the kind of stillness that didn't require filling. Harold never said much about himself. When Jihin asked where he was from, Harold answered, "Everywhere and nowhere." When Jihin asked if he had family, Harold said, "I have people." Whether their family is a different question. The answers were strange, too, composed, too carefully worded for a man who was supposed to have nothing, and Harold kept watching. He watched the janitor skip the corners when mopping. He watched the nurse who checked his IV with one hand while texting with the other. He watched the security guard on the day shift, not Jihin, who sat in the booth with his feet on the desk scrolling through his phone. Harold's eyes missed nothing, and his face gave away even less. On the third evening, Jihin arrived to find Harold sitting fully upright, legs swung over the side of the gurney, feet on the floor. He looked stronger. His back was straight, his shoulders squared. The weakness that had defined him 2 nights ago was fading, and what was emerging underneath looked nothing like a man who lived on the street. "You look better," Jihin said. "I feel like myself," Harold replied. And there was something in the way he said it, like myself was a very specific thing and not the version Jihin had been seeing. Jihin sat down and unwrapped the food. For a while, neither of them spoke. The hospital hummed around them, the distant beeping of monitors, the squeak of shoes on tile, the murmur of a television from a room down the hall. Then Harold asked a question that caught Jihin off guard. "Why did you do it?" Jihin looked at him. "Do what?" "Save me. That night." Harold's voice was steady, but his eyes held something raw. "You didn't know me. You had every reason to walk away. Your job, your livelihood. You knew exactly what it would cost, and you did it anyway." He tilted his head slightly. "I want to understand why." Jihin thought about it. Not because the answer was complicated, but because no one had ever asked. Not Hale, who only wanted to know what rules were broken. Not Diane, who only wanted to know who would pay. Not Brenda, not Derek, not anyone. They had all asked what he did. Harold was the first person to ask why. "Because you're a human being," Jihin said, "and you were dying. That's it." Harold didn't move. He sat there looking at Jihin with an expression that seemed to hold decades of something, weariness maybe, or recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "It's been a very long time since someone said that to me. That I'm a human being. Not a name, not a number, not what I own or what I've built." He looked down at his hands. "Just a human being." The moment lasted longer than either of them expected. The noise of the hospital faded into the background. 2 men sitting in a curtained bay, one in a plastic chair, one on a hospital gurney, and between them something that neither of them had a word for. Jihin didn't get to stay long. His phone buzzed 15 minutes later, a text from a number he recognized, the hospital's internal HR system. "Report to the Director of Operations Office. Tomorrow morning, 8 sharp. Disciplinary hearing." Jihin stared at the screen. He felt the weight of it settle into his chest, not surprise, but a kind of heavy confirmation. He had known this was coming. He had known it since the first night. Harold was watching him. "Bad news." Jihin put the phone away. "Nothing I didn't expect." He left shortly after. Harold watched him go, and something in the old man's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed on the doorway long after Jihin had disappeared. The disciplinary hearing took place the following morning in Conference Room B on the 3rd floor. Richard Hale sat at the head of the table. Beside him sat Linda Torres from Human Resources, a woman who spoke exclusively in policy language, and Frank Mercer, the head of security, Jihin's direct supervisor, a man who had never once defended any of his staff against administration. Jihin sat alone on the other side of the table. Hale laid it out the way a prosecutor lays out evidence. Surveillance footage showed Jihin entering the hospital on 3 consecutive evenings outside of his scheduled shifts. Footage showed him bringing outside food into a patient bay. Footage showed him spending extended periods with an unregistered individual who was occupying hospital resources without authorization. Combined with the original incident leaving his post, unauthorized use of supplies, misleading the on-duty physician, the pattern was clear. "You were given a written warning," Hale said. "You were told explicitly that any further incidents would result in termination, and yet here we are." He folded his hands on the table. "You have one opportunity right now, Mr. Williams. You can commit in writing to ending all contact with this individual and returning to strict compliance with hospital protocol. If you do that, we can discuss keeping you on staff. Probationary status, reduced responsibilities, but employed." Linda Torres slid a document across the table. Ji-hin looked at it. The language was dense, but the meaning was simple: sign this and promise to never again do what your conscience told you was right. Ji-hin looked at the document, then at Hale, then at Frank Mercer, who was staring at the table as if it contained something fascinating, then at the wall behind Hale's head where a framed poster read, "St. Albans Memorial, where every life matters." He didn't sign. Hale let the moment stretch for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once slowly, as though Ji-hin had finally confirmed something Hale had always suspected about him. "Then we're done here," Hale said. "Your termination will be processed today." But Hale didn't process it quietly. He didn't send an email or file the paperwork in a back office. He chose to do it in the lobby, in front of everyone. It was just after 9 in the morning. The shift change had brought the building to its busiest point: day staff arriving, night staff leaving, patients in the waiting area, families walking through the atrium. Hale came down from the 3rd floor, flanked by Linda Torres and Frank Mercer, and found Ji-hin near the East Wing corridor. He spoke loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "Ji-hin Williams, effective immediately, your employment at St. Albans Memorial Hospital is terminated. You are to surrender your access badge, your uniform, and any hospital property currently in your possession. Security will escort you from the building." The lobby went still. Not the respectful kind. The kind that happens when people smell blood and want to watch. Brenda Cole stood behind the front desk, arms folded across her chest, her chin tilted up slightly. She said nothing, but the corners of her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like confirmation. Like a woman watching a prediction come true. Diane Prescott was near the triage station, clipboard in hand. She glanced at Ji-hin briefly, then turned away and began writing something on the clipboard. Her hand was steady. She had decided visibly and deliberately that this was not her concern. Derek Shaw stood near the supply corridor mop handle in both hands, staring at the floor. He didn't look up. He didn't move. He just stood there, locked in place the way people do when they want to disappear without actually leaving. Ji-hin unclipped his badge. He set it on the front desk next to Brenda's magazine. He removed his uniform jacket, the dark navy one with the St. Albans patch on the shoulder, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the badge. Underneath, he wore a plain white t-shirt. He looked smaller without the uniform, more human. Hale watched this with his arms behind his back. When Ji-hin finished, Hale delivered the final line, the one Ji-hin would carry with him out the door and into whatever came next. "You should have known your place, Mr. Williams. You're not a doctor. You're not an administrator. You're not someone whose opinion this institution requires. You were a security guard, and you couldn't even do that right." The words hung in the air. Nobody challenged them. Nobody flinched. Ji-hin picked up his notebook from the desk, the small, worn notebook with the soft edges that he had carried for years. He put it in his back pocket. Then he turned and walked toward the East Wing, past the triage station, past the supply corridor, past all the people who had watched and said nothing. He stopped at the bay where Harold had been. The curtain was pulled back. The gurney was empty. The sheets had been stripped. The IV stand was gone. The cup, the food wrapper, the signs that a human being had existed in that space, all of it had been cleaned away as though Harold had never been there at all. Ji-hin stood in the empty bay for a long moment. Then he turned, walked through the east entrance, the same doors he had carried a dying man through 3 nights ago, and stepped into the daylight. Nobody followed him. Nobody called his name. Behind him in the lobby, Brenda Cole picked up her magazine. Derek Shaw went back to mopping. Diane Prescott continued writing on her clipboard. And Richard Hale straightened his tie, turned on his heel, and took the elevator back to the 3rd floor. The system had corrected itself. The disruption had been removed. Everything was back in order, or so they believed. Ji-hin drove home with the windows down. The air was warm and sharp with the smell of exhaust and wet asphalt. The city moved around him the way it always did, indifferent, busy, unconcerned, with one man in a 10-year-old sedan who had just lost the only thing keeping his life together. Traffic lights changed. People crossed the street. A woman on the corner laughed into her phone. The world hadn't noticed. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up on Glendale Avenue. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as a living room. Everything in it was clean and deliberate. The bed made with military tightness, the shoes lined up by the door, the dishes washed and stacked. It was the apartment of a man who believed that discipline was the one thing no one could take from you. He sat down at the kitchen table. In front of him, a stack of envelopes he'd been meaning to open. Electric bill, water bill, rent notice due in 11 days. He opened them one by one, read the numbers, and set each one face down on the table. The total didn't matter. What mattered was that every one of those numbers assumed he still had a paycheck coming. He didn't. His notebook sat on the table beside the envelopes. He opened it and flipped through the pages. Notes on hospital logistics, diagrams of emergency room workflow, a list of management books he wanted to read. A section labeled Goals Year 3, with bullet points written in neat, careful handwriting. Apply for shift supervisor, complete first aid certification, save enough for a better apartment. All of it written by a man who believed that effort and discipline would eventually be rewarded. That if he kept his head down, did his job well, and never complained, the system would eventually recognize him. Ji-hin closed the notebook. He folded the uniform he'd brought home, the dark navy jacket with the St. Albans patch, pressed the creases flat with his palms, and set it on the chair across from him. Neatly, precisely, the way he did everything, even now. Even for a job that had thrown him away. That night, he lay in bed with the ceiling staring back at him. Sleep didn't come. What came instead were the questions. Had he been wrong? If he had walked away from the old man, turned around, gone back to his booth, filed a report, waited for someone else to handle it, he would still have a job. He would still have a paycheck. He would still be Ji-hin Williams Night Security, St. Albans Memorial Employee number 7412. Invisible, yes. Underpaid, yes. But employed. And the old man, Harold. He had vanished. No goodbye. No thank you. No explanation. Just an empty gurney with stripped sheets, as if he had been erased from the building the same way Ji-hin had been erased from the payroll. Maybe Harold had been discharged. Maybe he had wandered back onto the streets. Maybe he was already dead somewhere, and everything Ji-hin had sacrificed had bought nothing more than a few extra days for a man nobody would ever miss. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. Not regret. Ji-hin didn't regret saving a life, but something close to it. Something that whispered the world doesn't reward people like you for doing what's right. It punishes them. And the punishment always comes from the people who could have done the same thing but chose not to. He turned onto his side and stared at the wall until the dark turned gray and the gray turned into morning. The days that followed blurred together. Ji-hin got up each morning, made coffee, sat by the window. He applied for job security positions, warehouse work, overnight stocking at the grocery chain on 5th. He heard nothing back. The apartment grew quieter with each passing day. The bills stayed on the kitchen table unopened now because he already knew the numbers, and knowing them again wouldn't change anything. A week passed, then another. Ji-hin stopped opening his notebook. There was nothing left to plan for. What Ji-hin didn't know was that on the same night he had been fired, a black sedan had pulled up to the service entrance of St. Albans Memorial at 3 in the morning. The security camera above the loading dock captured it clearly. A man in a dark suit stepped out of the passenger side, walked inside, and returned 4 minutes later. Beside him walked Harold. Not the Harold who had been lying on a gurney. Not the trembling, weathered man in torn clothes who needed help holding a cup of water. This Harold walked with his back straight, his stride steady, his chin lifted. The man in the suit held the car door open, and Harold stepped inside with the ease of someone who had been stepping into cars like that his entire life. The sedan pulled away. The camera kept recording, and nobody at St. Albans ever watched the footage because a homeless man disappearing from a hospital bed wasn't a mystery. It was a convenience. 2 weeks after the night Jihin had carried a dying man out of the rain, a Gulfstream G700 touched down at the regional airport just outside the city. It taxied to the private terminal where a convoy of 4 black SUVs sat idling on the tarmac. The jet's door opened, a set of stairs unfolded, and a man in a black suit descended, white hair combed back, cleanly posture-straight face, sharp and clean-shaven, flanked by 2 assistants and a security detail. Harold Whitmore had come back. 20 minutes later, the convoy turned onto Drayton Street and stopped in front of St. Albans Memorial's main entrance. The morning had begun the same as every other morning. Brenda Cole was at the front desk, flipping through a celebrity magazine. Diane Prescott was reviewing charts near the triage station. Derek Shaw was mopping the West Wing. Richard Hale was on the 3rd floor answering emails. The building hummed with its usual rhythm, efficient, expensive, and utterly sure of itself. The new security guard, Jihin's replacement, a kid barely out of training, stood up from the booth and stared through the glass. He had never seen anything like this. 4 vehicles, tinted windows, the kind of formation that usually preceded someone very important or something very wrong. The doors of the second SUV opened first. 2 men in suits stepped out, sharp, composed, carrying leather portfolios. Then a woman with a tablet already speaking into an earpiece. From the 3rd vehicle, 2 more men, broader, watchful, clearly security. They formed a loose perimeter near the entrance without saying a word. And then the rear door of the lead vehicle opened. Harold stepped out. He was unrecognizable. His white hair, the same white hair that had been matted with rain and plastered to his skull, was now combed back, cut close on the sides. He wore a black suit that fit him like it had been built on his body. His shoes reflected the morning light. His face, clean-shaven and sharp, carried the same angular bone structure Jihin had noticed in the hospital bay. But without the grime and exhaustion, it carried something else entirely. Authority. He walked toward the entrance without hesitation. His team followed. The automatic doors slid open and Harold stepped into the lobby of St. Albans Memorial the way a man steps into a building he already owns. Because he did. Brenda Cole looked up from her magazine. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She didn't recognize him, not yet. She just saw power walking through the door, and her instinct was to sit up straighter. Harold's assistant, a tall woman named Grace Bennett, walked beside him, speaking into her phone in a voice that carried across the lobby. "Mr. Whitmore is on site. Please notify the board that the meeting has been moved up. Yes, today. Immediately." The name landed on the lobby like a thunderclap. Whitmore. Harold Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Capital, one of the largest private investment firms on the East Coast. The man whose fund had poured $40 million into the healthcare conglomerate that owned St. Albans Memorial. The man whose signature sat at the bottom of the hospital's largest capital allocation in the last decade. The man who had been lying on a gurney in an emergency bay 2 weeks ago eating a turkey sandwich that a security guard had bought with $7.50. Brenda's face drained of color. Her hands, still resting on the magazine, began to tremble. Harold didn't look at her. He walked past the front desk, past the triage station, past the corridor where Derek Shaw had frozen mid-stroke with his mop, and went directly to the elevator. His team followed in tight formation. He pressed the button for the 3rd floor. Richard Hale was still at his desk when the conference room door opened. He didn't know what was happening until Linda Torres appeared in his doorway, her face drained of color, and told him that Harold Whitmore was in the building and requesting an immediate meeting with the full management team. Hale straightened his tie. He smoothed his jacket. He walked into conference room B, the same room where he had given Jihin his ultimatum, and found Harold Whitmore sitting at the head of the table. The seat Hale always sat in. The seat no one else had ever dared to take. Harold looked at him the way a man looks at something he is about to dismantle. "Sit down, Mr. Hale." Hale sat. Harold folded his hands on the table. His voice was calm, controlled, and carried the kind of weight that doesn't need volume. 2 weeks ago, I lay on the concrete outside your emergency entrance. It was raining. I was cold. I couldn't stand. I was by every measure that matters dying. He swept his gaze across the table, Linda Torres, Frank Mercer Hale. Do you know who brought me inside? No one answered. A security guard, Harold continued. A man named Jihin Williams. He carried me through those doors. He wrapped me in blankets. He called your doctor. He came back every night after that on his own time with his own money to bring me food and sit with me. Harold leaned forward slightly. And do you know what you did to that man? Hale's jaw tightened. His hands clasped on the table in front of him, pressed against each other until the knuckles went pale. You fired him, Harold said. In front of everyone, you humiliated him. You told him he should have known his place. The words landed one at a time like stones dropped into still water. I have invested $40 million in this institution. $40 million. And the only person in this entire building who treated a dying man like a human being, you threw him out like garbage. The room was still. Linda Torres stared at the table. Frank Mercer's eyes were fixed on the far wall, his face empty. Richard Hale stared straight ahead, his expression locked in a mask that was trying very hard to hold together and failing. Harold stood up. Effective immediately. Mr. Hale, your position as Director of Operations is terminated. Ms. Torres, Mr. Mercer, your roles will be reviewed by the board within the week. I am ordering a full audit of this hospital's intake policies, patient treatment standards, and human resources practices. He buttoned his jacket. And I want Jihin Williams found, today. Outside the conference room, the news spread through the building like a fire through dry wood. Staff gathered in clusters, whispering, glancing toward the third floor. And the faces that had watched Jihin walk out now wore very different expressions. Brenda Cole sat behind the front desk, motionless. Her magazine was closed. Her arms, which had been folded with such satisfaction during Jihin's firing, now hung at her sides. She stared at the elevator doors with the look of someone replaying every word she had ever said, and realizing too late that all of them had been heard. Diane Prescott stood near the triage station clipboard, pressed against her chest like a shield. She wasn't writing. She wasn't moving. She was remembering a rainy night when a man on the radio had asked for medical help outside the east entrance, and she had told him to call 911. Her hand, the one that had been so steady while she wrote on her clipboard during Jihin's firing, was no longer steady. Derek Shaw stood near the supply corridor mop handle in both hands, in the same posture he had held during the firing. But this time, he wasn't staring at the floor. He was staring at nothing. His mouth slightly opened, the words he had said to Jihin, echoing somewhere behind his eyes. Shoulda left him out there, man. Wasn't worth it. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Their faces said everything their mouths never had. Grace Bennett made the call that afternoon. She dialed Jihin's number 3 times before he picked up. Mr. Williams, please hold for Harold Whitmore. A click. Then a voice Jihin recognized, the same quiet, precise voice from the hospital bay. But stronger now. Fuller, without the hoarseness or the fatigue. Jihin, Harold said. It's the old man from the rain. Jihin sat at his kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, the stack of bills still spread in front of him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. I owe you an explanation, Harold said. And more than that, I owe you the truth about who you saved. Come to the hospital tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, front entrance. I'll be waiting. Jihin arrived at St. Albans Memorial at 8:50 the next morning. He wore the only dress shirt he owned, light blue ironed that morning, and a pair of dark slacks. No uniform. No badge, no access card. He walked through the main entrance the same way he had walked out 2 weeks ago, except this time, every head in the lobby turned. Harold was standing in the center of the atrium. Suit, silver watch, posture that belonged on the cover of a business magazine. Beside him stood Grace Bennett and 2 members of his legal team. Behind them, a small group of hospital board members stood in a loose, uncomfortable semicircle. Harold saw Jihin and walked toward him. He extended his hand. Jihin took it. The handshake lasted longer than a handshake normally does. It carried the weight of a gurney in a curtained bay, a turkey sandwich on a plastic tray, a question asked in the dark. "Why did you do it?" And an answer that had meant more than the man who gave it ever knew. Harold turned to the room. His voice filled the atrium without effort. "This is Jihan Williams. 2 weeks ago, he saved my life. He broke every rule this hospital has to do it. He was punished for it. He was humiliated for it. And he was fired for it." Harold placed his hand on Jihan's shoulder. "Starting today, Jihan Williams is the Director of Humanitarian Operations at St. Albans Memorial, a position I've created specifically because this institution clearly needs someone in it who understands that a hospital exists to save lives. All lives, regardless of paperwork." Jihan looked at Harold. He looked at the board members. He looked at the lobby, the same tile, the same lights, the same front desk where Brenda Cole sat frozen, and he understood fully and finally what had happened. Not just to him, but to the old man he had carried through the rain who turned out to be the most powerful person in the building. He didn't say a speech. He didn't make a scene. He simply nodded, shook Harold's hand one more time, and said, "Thank you, sir." Harold shook his head. "No, son. Thank you." 6 weeks later, Jihan walked the east wing of St. Albans Memorial at 8 in the evening, wearing a dark suit and an ID badge that read, Director of Humanitarian Operations. He carried a tablet now instead of a flashlight, and his worn notebook sat in his jacket pocket, still there, still full of notes, still growing. He checked the intake logs, reviewed the overnight staffing plan, and spoke briefly with the new triage nurse about a patient who had been flagged for follow-up. The rain started just after 9. It came through fast and heavy, drumming against the windows, the same way it had all those weeks ago. Jihan was near the east entrance when he saw it, a figure outside sitting on the wet concrete beneath the narrow awning knees, pulled to chest, head down. The new security guard, a young woman barely 3 months into the job, noticed it too. She looked at the figure on the monitor, then looked at her phone, then looked back at the monitor. Jihan could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Protocol said one thing, but the rain said another. Jihan didn't wait for her to decide. He walked to the east doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit his suit, immediately soaking the shoulders, flattening his tie against his chest. He crouched beside the figure, a man middle-aged, shivering, clutching a plastic bag of belongings, and put a hand on the man's shoulder. "Hey, let's get you inside." The man looked up at him with confused, exhausted eyes. I don't have insurance. I don't have anything." "You don't need anything," Jihan said. "You just need to come inside." He helped the man to his feet and walked him through the east entrance, the same doors, the same hallway, the same fluorescent lights. The security guard watched from her booth, unsure. Jihan nodded at her once as he passed. Not a command, not a correction. Just a man showing someone else what it looks like to do the right thing so that the next time she might do it too. The rain kept falling. The monitors kept recording. And Jihan Williams, who had once been invisible, who had once been called replaceable, who had once been told to know his place, walked a stranger in from the cold the same way he always had. The title was different now. The suit was different. The badge was different. But the man was the same. Because real authority was never about the position. It was about what you did when no one was watching. And the people the world overlooked, the ones it laughed at, the ones it stepped over, the ones it fired and forgot, were often the ones it should never have underestimated. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about the people you walk past every day, the ones the world tells you don't matter, then maybe it's worth sharing. Not for us, but for them. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is doing the right thing and getting punished for it. And maybe all they need is to know that somebody sees them. If you're that person, we see you. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been punished for doing the right thing? We read every single one. And if this story hit you in the chest the way it hit us, pass it along. You never know who needs to hear it tonight.